Hi, I'm Jake Shapiro. I head up creator partnerships for Apple Podcasts.
I'm James Cridland, the editor of podnews.net, the daily podcasting newsletter.
Hi, I'm Adam Curry. I am the co-creator of podcasting and the co-creator of Podcasting 2.0.
And the most important trend in 2022 was subscriptions.
The biggest story of this year, I think, is all around walled garden and consolidation in podcasting.
I gotta say, the biggest story of 2022 is exactly the same as 2021, is the same as 2020, which is Podcasting 2.0, obviously.
2022 was a crazy year for podcasting. There were countless headlines and so many moves, it can be hard to keep up with everything that happened.
But you don't have to. We went through all the top stories again. We bought the gear and we tested it and we actually interviewed the experts. And so it's all here. It's all organized.
We might have gotten a bit obsessive, but it's okay. We've synthesized it all in here in this video to help you examine the top trends of 2022.
So that you're prepared for 2023.
Apple is a famously secretive company, but in 2022, they shared a ton of resources with indie podcasters through their Apple Podcast for Creators Resource Hub.
They released articles on the best way to promote a podcast. They shared how Apple Podcast search works, and they even did live training sessions between the Apple Podcast team and podcasters.
Yeah, one of my favorite improvements that Apple made was the engaged followers metric, which allows you to see how engaged your listeners are with your episode.
Right, and since Apple Podcasts accounts for 40% of all podcast downloads across the whole ecosystem, it was really cool to see them invest a lot in the Apple Podcast app.
We know it was really important to introduce more ways to manage storage so listeners can now configure preferences for automatic downloads, make sure what they want is available in the right moment. We refreshed the designs for Now Playing. We updated the library in CarPlay. Improvements to Listen Now and search on Apple Watch. And we also introduced a whole new iPad app, which is pretty exciting. And it's been great to see that adopted.
With so many people using Apple Podcasts, it's really great to see how responsive they are to their listeners and podcasters. So we can't wait to see what they have in store for 2023. For years, podcasters have complained about the incredible amount of email spam that hits their inbox.
Hi, friend. I love your content. Could my CEO be a guest on your podcast?
I don't even have guests on my podcast.
Hey, Jolan, have you claimed your podcast on our new listening app? It'll help you reach so many new listeners.
I have never even heard of this app. It got so bad in March that podcasters started asking how these shady marketers were getting their emails in the first place.
So one of the things about an RSS feed in podcasting is that historically it's always had to have an email address in there so that you can claim your podcast and show that you own it and all of that. But of course, people discovered that this was a great place to find email addresses of people that run podcasts.
In July, James Cridland, the editor of podnews.net, ran a spam honeypot and received over 240 emails in just 2 months.
But once he started naming the spammers, he saw a steep drop in the number of emails.
A few months later, Apple announced they'd no longer require emails to be in RSS feeds starting in 2023.
And after extensive testing, Buzzsprout removed email addresses from all podcasters' feeds. And since then, both Podbean and Transistor FM have done the same.
So if you're hosted on any of those 3 platforms, you're going to see a drastic reduction in the amount of spam your podcast receives.
In 2023, we hope these changes make your podcast inbox a little bit cleaner.
But what about our email?
Podcast statistics have improved significantly in recent years, thanks to organizations like OPOG and the IAB. Stats help podcasters see how well their show is performing and where to direct their marketing efforts.
Stats got even better in 2022. John Spurlock's work with the OP3 project made it possible for people to track their podcast stats no matter where they host their show. And they'll also be able to make their podcast stats public for anybody to see.
Buzzsprout also improved its analytics dashboard with a feature that allows users to create custom date ranges when running reports on their podcasts.
And then Apple launched some new developer tools so that third-party podcast apps can better identify themselves to your podcast host.
All of this means that you'll get a more transparent and accurate picture of your podcast performance in 2023. In 2022, we had a few stories that took us back to 2001 at the very beginning of podcasting.
And we found the long-lost blog post from Adam Curry that may have been the genesis of podcasting. I mean, this is a fascinating read. You start to kind of see all the podcasting pieces start falling into place.
And Pod News found a show from the late Robin Williams that sounds a lot like a podcast.
Oh yeah, it doesn't nothing really good comes easy, man. Nothing that I know about comes easy.
I'll tell you that, my friend. Don't come easy.
Don't come easy.
No, if it come easy, everybody'd do it all the time.
Yeah.
As prescient as Curry and Williams were back in the early 2000s, we can't imagine that they expected where podcasting would end up in 2022.
For years, the only overlap between AI and podcasting were the conversations on the Lex Fridman podcast.
But in 2022, we saw a wave of new AI tools to improve podcast workflow. Sonantic and Lobo provide voice cloning technology that makes podcasts sound as if they were recorded by a real-life person.
Yeah, but how would you feel about a podcast between two people that never actually spoke to each other?
This year, an AI podcast featuring Joe Rogan and the late Steve Jobs went viral using synthetic voices that sound creepily realistic.
Yeah.
It's always good to see you, buddy. I'm so happy you came on, man.
Yeah, it's great to be on the show. Your audience is just so different from your normal Apple users, and that's a good thing. It's cool.
The growing availability of AI tools presents new opportunities for creators in 2023.
We can see podcasters using AI to translate their podcasts into different languages to reach new audiences.
Or a podcaster could employ voice cloning technology if they're in a politically restricted area and they want to protect their identity.
Podcasters have been using YouTube to upload video versions of their shows for years, which has been a game changer for a lot of these shows.
Yeah. Recently, YouTube has started paying closer attention to podcasts.
In 2021, YouTube appointed Kai Chuck as the head of podcasting, and in 2022, we started seeing some of YouTube's plans come together.
First, YouTube launched a dedicated podcast page for users in the United States. Then they announced audio-only ads to help podcasters monetize audio-only shows on YouTube.
And just last month, they published a 68-page guide to best practices for podcasting on YouTube.
Yeah. Finally, Edison Research found that 55% of podcast listeners use YouTube to listen to some podcasts.
And in 2023, we speculate that they'll introduce even more people to the wonderful world of podcasting. In 2020, the meteoric rise of Clubhouse inspired big tech companies to experiment with live audio and podcasting.
Yeah, but as the years passed and Clubhouse's popularity started to fizzle out, some of these big tech experiments started to flop.
Facebook shut down Facebook Podcast.
And Twitter Podcast turned out to be nothing more than a page with a few episodes on it.
But other platforms are investing resources into their live audio, including Amazon's AMP.
Reddit with Reddit Talk.
And there's even speculation of TikTok preparing to step into podcasting.
We'll see if any of these initiatives have the staying power and offer podcasters a new avenue to reach new audiences.
Back in 2021, Apple launched Apple Podcast subscriptions, and then Spotify announced Spotify Open Access.
Yeah, these services paved the way for podcasters to start selling premium content to their listeners.
In 2022, more podcasters started using premium content to make money from their podcasts.
We hear from podcasters all the time that diversifying revenue is a big priority. It's been awesome to see podcasters, both large and small, start to really embrace a subscription strategy and unlock new revenue, but also give something special to their truest fans.
Apple launched subscription charts to highlight the most popular premium content in Apple Podcasts. And then they announced Apple Podcast Delegated Delivery.
Delegated Delivery allows podcasters to manage an Apple Podcast subscription from within their third-party hosting provider, like Buzzsprout.
And we're excited to see indie podcasters start making meaningful money from their podcast through paid subscriptions.
Podcasting 2.0 is an initiative by one of the founders of podcasting to preserve the freedom and open ecosystem of podcasting.
For Podcasting 2.0, really the initial mission was to protect podcasting by creating an open and freely available index and database and API for all podcast apps to tap into.
Podcasting 2.0 brings together the podcast listening apps, the podcast hosts, and podcast creators to improve podcasting altogether.
And there have been a lot of improvements in 2022.
Podping, so the decentralized push notification technology, that's been adopted by over 400,000 RSS feeds. It drastically reduces server costs for podcasts.
The transcript tag has been used by over 250,000 podcast episodes to provide episode transcripts alongside podcast audio.
And the TXT tag has been adopted to help validate podcast ownership while still hiding email addresses from the podcast spammers.
The Podcasting 2.0 initiative was also the driving force behind our next trend, Bitcoin micropayments in podcasts. Podcasting 2.0 paved the way for podcasters to start receiving micropayments to their podcasts using the Bitcoin Lightning Network.
And that's when I found the Lightning Network, and Dave Jones and I put our heads together, and then we kind of made this extension of value for value, where you can send a boostagram, which is basically a payment with a message, but you can also stream per minute and say, I just want this podcast to get, $1 an hour or whatever the number is.
And in 2022, a bunch of new tools made this significantly simpler.
Cash App added Lightning support, so that made it easier for people to fund their Lightning wallets in podcast apps.
Alby, in conjunction with Saturn, makes it possible for creators to see top contributors, read messages associated with payments, and get a sense of what content resonates most with fans.
And then apps like Fountain and Cast-O-Matic drastically improved the user experience for listeners who want to use Bitcoin to support their favorite podcast creators.
And podcast host RSS.com and Dystopia both added the value for value tag into their apps. For years, podcasters have had to make do with gear that was essentially hand-me-downs from the music industry.
But in 2022, audio brands started paying closer attention to podcasters.
Focusrite added an audio interface for podcasting called the Vocaster.
And then Rode launched the Rode X, a complete audio solution made for streaming and podcasting.
And Rode also announced the NTH 100 headphones made for mixing and extended wear.
And then Elgato released their first ever dynamic microphone for creators, the Wave XD.
The common thread for new gear in 2022 is that it's plug and play and optimized for the human voice.
Yeah, further lowering the barrier of entry for new podcasters.
This year, we saw the second annual Ambies, where podcasts were celebrated for their achievements in the industry.
And as podcasting's grown up, we've started to see a bit of the underbelly of podcasting.
We saw headlines of podcast guests paying 5 figures to appear on popular shows without disclosing the payments to the public.
Ooh, and the New York Times repurposed Kara Swisher's RSS feed to promote a totally different show once Swisher left.
There are reports of toxic work culture at well-respected podcast networks.
Oh, and there's this crazy story, a legal story, where these Dubai call girls were starting
We're gonna keep this PG and let them read about that on their own time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair. But on the bright side, podcasting industry is still growing.
And by talking about issues like these openly and honestly, we can help shape the future of podcasting into something positive for everyone.
Yeah.
2022 was filled with a lot of great moments for the industry. And none of this would have happened without you, the creators and listeners.
Yeah, podcasters are experimenting with new formats, trying out new ways of expressing themselves, and using the medium to reach audiences all around the world.
So on behalf of Buzzsprout and everyone in the podcast community, we thank you for creating your podcast and making podcasting what it is today.
Yeah, if you want to go deeper with any of these stories that I've put up on this board, I've linked them all in the description below. And if you think there's one we missed, let us know in the comments, and we'll make sure it gets on the board.
Here's to 2023.
And
keep podcasting. Did I make you bleed?